Shabbat Shalom. Tonight, it is my honor to welcome and introduce Professor Kenji Yoshino to our Central Synagogue community. Professor Yoshino is the Chief Justice Earl Warren Professor of Constitutional Law at NYU School of Law and the Director of the Center for Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging. He is a graduate of Harvard, Oxford, and Yale with specialties in constitutional law, anti-discrimination law, and law and literature. Professor Yoshino is the author of 3 books, including the newly published Say the Right Thing, How to Talk About Identity, Diversity, and Justice, co-authored with David Glasgow. You may have heard Professor Yoshino even today speaking on NPR, CNN, MSNBC, or maybe you've read his articles in the New York Times, the Washington Post, or the LA Times. Jewish tradition teaches us to uphold and protect the dignity of every person, especially those most vulnerable in our society, those whose voices have been silenced, those whose rights have been curtailed, those who do not have anyone to advocate on their behalf. Professor Yoshino embodies these teachings. He is a fierce advocate on the national stage, a voice for justice, mercy, and inclusion, and a champion of minority rights and human dignity. Professor Yoshino, your presence here tonight in our celebration of Pride is made even more meaningful and crucial based on today's ruling by the Supreme Court. Thank you so much for joining us and for sharing your wisdom and expertise with our community. It is my honor to welcome you to the Bima. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you
so much. Shabbat Shalom. It is incredibly restorative for me to be here on this evening after a rough week at the Supreme Court. So thank you so much for sharing your community with me. It's really been an honor. I'm going to go a little retro on you, I'm afraid, to talk about work that I did earlier on in my career, but I hope that you will still find it of meaning and resonance. I was sort of fortified in doing this by noting that Justice Sotomayor, in her dissent to the Elenis case, the case that Rabbi Hillel was talking about, cited this early work of mine, and so I'm going to go back into the archive for it. So I want to tell a story 3 times, and the first time I'm going to tell it, it's going to be about me. The second time I tell it, it's going to be about the LGBTQ plus community, and the third time I tell it, I hope that it will be about all of us. So the first rendition of the story is about how I came to be standing before you today as an openly gay man. And in order to do that, I felt I needed to overcome 3 different waves of assimilation: the demand to convert, the demand to pass, and then finally the demand to cover. So I came into awareness of my sexuality relatively late by today's standards. I went off after I graduated from college to Oxford University to do some graduate work. Deracinated from my family and my community at home, I was forced to face myself in new ways and came to the realization that I was gay. These were dark, difficult days for me. This is 1991. The only consistent foray I remember making from my rooms was to go to the college chapel, where I prayed to gods I was not even sure I believed in for conversion. Because I believed that at the time, the only pathways to a happy life, a profession, a family, was to convert to being straight. It is very difficult for me to think about that young man knelt down in prayer because he so ardently wished the annihilation of the man I had become. To see him clearly is to feel the outlines of my present self grow fainter. It was only after I left Oxford and started at Yale Law School that I accepted the fact that I was gay, moved away from the demand to convert, and into the passing phase of my life. Because even after I arrived at Yale Law School, which is one of the most progressive, open communities I've ever had the privilege to touch, along with my home institution of NYU, I was still terrified of disclosing the fact that I was gay to my classmates. Fortunately, or unfortunately for me, that was the first year in the entire history of the Yale Law School that they offered a course called Sexual Orientation and the Law. They didn't have anyone in their full-time faculty who could teach it, And so they hired an adjunct from the ACLU to do so. So I knew I had a very small window of opportunity because he could give up and not teach the class the next year. So I really wanted to take it, but I also felt that if I did, I would effectively be outing myself to the entire school. Because this is now 1993, and in 1993, the only people who took a class called Sexual Orientation and the Law were members of the LGBTQ+ community and a few righteous straight women. A straight man would not be caught within 100 miles of a class called Sexual Orientation and the Law. So I remember going into the professor's office and saying to him, and I was shaking, I really want to take this class. I'm gay, but I'm not openly gay. And I worry that if I sign up for this class, I will effectively be outing myself to the entire law school community, and I described the reasons why. And he gave a really surprising response. At least it was surprising to me. He said, don't take the class. He said, you should not come out on anyone's schedule but your own. You should not come out on an institution's schedule. This is not about which semester you're going to come out. This is about your own personal journey. But he said, and again, in words I'll never forget, I'll make a contract with you. He said, you've taken first-year contracts, you know what one is. If you take the syllabus and you keep up with the readings, I'll talk about the materials anytime you want. So this is actually the most consequential pedagogical gift I've ever received, because over the course of that semester, and indeed the year, I did keep up with the readings, I did have those conversations with him, and by the end of that series of conversations, I knew what I was going to do with my life. I knew that I was going to become a scholar of LGBTQ+ rights, and I was just itching to get started. Because this is now 1996, and the ice is breaking up. Romer versus Evans, the first case to bring the LGBTQ community into the ambit of the Equal Protection Clause has been decided, and I felt that I could do good work. I saw individuals being denied custody of their children, being denied employment, even being thrown in jail simply for loving someone of the same sex, and I knew that I had a calling. So I would never say that I was the smartest person or even the hardest working person in my class, but the amazing thing about connecting with your authenticity is that it gives you a power and a passion. It gives you a clarity and sense of purpose that you otherwise would not have. And so 18 months after I graduated from Yale Law School, I was hired back as a junior professor there, and the sense, more than anything else, was relief, because I thought for the first time in my life, I had been hired by people, all of whom know that I'm a gay man, so I can stop managing my sexual orientation. Unfortunately, this proved to be naive. The very first month I was at Yale Law School, a very friendly, well-meaning colleague put his arm around my shoulder, and he said, let me give you some advice. You'll have a lot smoother ride in the tenure process if you are a homosexual professional than if you are a professional homosexual. And I knew exactly what he meant. He meant you'll do much better if you're the mainstream constitutional law professor who teaches separation of powers and judicial review and federalism, and just happens to be gay on the side as an extracurricular activity, than you will do if you are the gay rights guy who's writing on gay rights subjects and teaching on gay rights issues and working on gay rights cases. And frankly, such was the terror of the tenure track that for a short period of time, I tried to accede to this demand and tamp down the ways in which I might be hyper-visible as a gay man, as the only untenured person on the faculty and as the only gay person on the faculty. But after a while, I realized that this was not what I had set out to do, and I realized that I would much rather not get tenure, being someone who I was, than get tenure as someone who I was not. And so I flipped back over to doing the things I cared about, and a few years later got tenure unanimously, flipping even the person who had given me the advice. So this is a very happy story, and I think it's interesting, but I would be kind of full of hubris if I thought this would be consequential to convey to you if I really just thought it was my story. But I don't think this is just my story. I think this is a story of the gay rights movement as a whole. And I specifically think of the LGBT movement here, leaving trans aside respectfully for a moment, because I think the issues of assimilation may be different for the trans community. But at least for what I will call the gay rights community, this has been a journey for us as a group through those three successive demands: the demand to convert, the demand to pass, and what I will call the demand to cover. Because long after I'd overcome the advice, I didn't know how to term the demand that had been made of me. No one at Yale wanted me to convert to being straight. No one at Yale wanted me to stay in the closet. But some people at Yale wanted me to downplay the fact that I was gay in the form of the advice that I received. I didn't have a word for that third assimilationist demand, and so I did what academics do. I cast my nets out on the waters, and I found a term in Irving Goffman's book, the famous sociologist, stigma, Notes on the Management of Spoiled Identity. Goffman says, people who cannot or do not wish to hide the fact that they belong to a particular group, nonetheless can expend a huge amount of effort from keeping that difference from looming large. And he called that covering. So I want to say that this covering notion is what I wrote my first book on, thinking about how it manifested both in my own life. But one of the pivots I make in the book is a pivot I want to make now to say this is not just my story, this is the story of the gay rights movement. So now let me tell the second iteration of the story, and that is about the LGBT community as a group. So, as many of you know, through the middle decades of the 20th century, gay individuals were driven into conversion en masse. Gay people were subjected to aversion therapy, electroshock therapy, in extreme cases, lobotomy or castration to change them, hopefully, or the hope was, into heterosexuals. And it was only with the rise of the modern gay rights movement and the post-Stonewall era, after the 1969 Stonewall riots here in New York City, that the demand shifted, and I want to say really clearly, in emphasis, not categorically, but it shifted in emphasis away from conversion and towards passing. And I can think of no better example of this than the military's don't ask, don't tell policy, which replaced a rule that said, homosexuality is incompatible with military service, with a rule that said, so long as you remain in the closet, you can serve. Now, this don't ask, don't tell policy didn't spring parthenogenetically from the head of Congress, but grew organically out of an underlying culture. So I'm sure many of you in the LGBT community and otherwise have had this experience where everybody knows, right, that you're gay, but you nonetheless feel enormous pressure not to say anything about it. What is dangerous, as D.A. Miller says, is not knowledge, but rather acknowledgement of the knowledge that we all hold. And so this is a passing phase, and it was only really at the turn of the 21st century that I think we moved again in emphasis, not categorically, away from the passing demand toward the covering demand. And the covering demand says it's okay for you to be gay and say that you're gay, but help us forget it. Make it easy for us to disattend. Edit your own identity so that other people can be more comfortable around you. So having been heavily involved in the movement for same-sex marriage, I saw this over and over again in very strange ways, right, in the marriage context, where my party's opposite in these debates would say, it's fine for you to live your life as you wish, but don't sort of flaunt your sexual orientation by asking for marriage equality. So that to me was a very, very strange statement, but I heard it over and over again. Because when people said, you're free to live as you wish, my response was, well, what if I wish to live under terms of full equality, right? Why is that termed to be a form of flaunting rather than a simple request to be treated the same as others? But nonetheless, I heard this so often that I came to think about the opposition to marriage as being an opposition that took the form of the covering demand, a kind of anti-flaunting regime, if you will. Now we come to the third telling of the story, which is to expand the sphere still beyond the LGBTQ+ community and think about it more broadly with regard to all of us. So I really want to make 2 points here. One is, particularly standing before this august congregation, I'd be really remiss to note, not to note, right, that the forms of assimilation that have been required of the LGBTQ+ community have also been required of many religious communities. So here I would have much more to learn than to teach, but I assume that many of you could tell me stories, either individual stories or stories of your faith, right, as a group, about having to battle the demand for conversion, having to battle the demand to pass, and then finally having to battle the covering demand. So in that way, I want to point out that religious communities in the LGBTQ plus community, although we are often pitted against each other in the popular imagination, actually have deep similarities that we do not share with other civil rights groups like racial minorities or women, with regard to how much we are deemed to be able to convert, pass, or cover, right, in the popular imagination. The larger point that I want to make here is that even though some groups can convert, pass, and cover, or are thought to be able to convert, pass, and cover, many, many groups are not able to convert or to pass. So when we're talking about racial minorities or women, conversion demands and passing demands are not going to be made of those groups in any systematic way, because those groups are seen to have immutable or visible characteristics. But notice what happens when we get to covering. When we get to covering, suddenly we see an interest alignment across all groups, because the covering demand directs itself at the behavioral aspects of our identity, which are deemed to be within all of our control. So that means that when we get to covering, anyone who is outside the mainstream in any way is going to be, from time to time, subjected to the covering demand. And in 2023, I would offer to you that it is not normal to be completely normal in America. And so therefore, all of us will find ourselves outside of the mainstream on some dimension, and all of us will find ourselves subjected to this covering demand. Right? So what am I thinking of? I'm thinking about the Black individual who's asked to straighten her hair so that it looks more professional, or not to wear a hoodie, right, lest they look too ghetto. I'm thinking about the woman, right, who's being told not to discuss the fact that she is a mother, lest she be taken less seriously at work. I'm talking about the Asian American who's told that he will be completely accepted, but not to act so fresh off the boat, right, with this idea that Asian Americans can be perpetual foreigners. I'm talking about the Latinx individual who's told not to speak Spanish in an English-only workplace, right, because it makes people around him uncomfortable, even though what he's demonstrating is not the lack of ability to speak English, but the capacity to speak English and another language. So we might regard that as a proficiency rather than a deficiency. I'm thinking about the person with a disability who's told to use a cane rather than a wheelchair, because even though the wheelchair may permit them to function more sort of seamlessly and with less pain, other people are more comfortable around them when they use a cane rather than wheeling into the room. So across all of these multifarious civil rights dimensions, we see the covering demand in play, and is a final form, right, of assimilation that all of us need to overcome together to reach the kind of beloved community that is truly inclusive, that declares there are many different valid ways to be a human being, and all of those are welcome here. So that's the optimistic rendition of the story, lest you still have at your heartstrings the kind of image of this young man knelt down in prayer. I'm happy to report that I now have a husband of 14 years. We have 2 beautiful children and a Great Dane. So my home life, resembles much more of a kind of Marmaduke cartoon than that young man knelt down in prayer could ever have imagined. So on all those dimensions, I want to say this is a very joyous and prideful moment. But I also want to note that we live in a world that is incredibly polarized and fractious, and there are dark days ahead. So I want to note that there are ways in which we see both the covering demand rearing its head, but also in more nefarious and pernicious ways, the clock being turned back on these demands, so it seems like we're almost going backwards, right? So as many of you are aware, hate crimes against both the Jewish community and the LGBTQ plus community are on the rise. So the Anti-Defamation League declared that 2021 was an all-time high for anti-Semitic hate crimes worldwide. That number went down in 2022 in the world, but not in the United States. Similarly, the ADL, in conjunction with GLAAD, the pro-gay media advocacy group, so in an act of allyship, ADL did a study that looked at gay hate crimes and found that gay hate crimes were also on the rise. One thing that I noted as I read both of these studies was that both studies referenced the fact that the people who are most likely to be victimized were the individuals who were perceived as somehow, quote unquote, flaunting their identities, right? So within the Jewish community, it was people who wore religious paraphernalia. In the LGBTQ plus community, it was individuals like drag performers who were perceived in the public to be sort of visibly or aggressively queer, right? So I wanted you to see that the covering demand still has enormous force, and I also want to add on an even more kind of dour or deflationary note that in some respects we seem to be going backwards. So when I look at anti-CRT legislation, or when I look at the Don't Say Gay bill in Florida, I actually see kind of vestiges of the closet, right? Of saying, we don't want you to talk about this, we don't want you to identify yourself as belonging to a particular group. So where is the hope here, right? I said this has been a rough few weeks for me. I would sort of expand that and to say this isn't just at the individual level of hate crimes. When we turn to government, we often find that government fails us. So we see over 520 bills being proposed that are anti-LGBTQ+. When we look to the courts for relief under the Equal Protection Clause or the Due Process Clause, we don't see a huge amount of sympathy. So we looked at the Dobbs case, last year, which struck down or overturned Roe versus Wade. Even in this past week, we've seen this court strike down affirmative action, effectively overruling 4 decades of precedent. We saw just this morning the court hand down a decision that said that there was a free speech right of individuals who are running public accommodation, so selling goods to the public to deny service on free speech expressive grounds to support same-sex marriage. Right? We also saw on socioeconomic status grounds President Biden's bill for student debt relief being invalidated by the court. So on gender grounds, on LGBTQ plus grounds, on race grounds, on SES grounds, we're seeing a very kind of dark landscape even at the governmental level. Right? So where can we find hope in this? I want to sort of end with this comment, right, which is to say, there's a quote that I love, which unfortunately I discovered is misattributed to Gandhi. But the quote is, first they ignore us, then they laugh at us, then they fight us, and then we win. Right? So if you think about that, what does that actually mean? Right? It certainly follows the trajectory of LGBTQ plus rights, because I am old enough to be able to remember a time when being gay was completely unspeakable and there were no Supreme Court cases that dealt with homosexuality. The ICE kind of broke up, right, for the first time in 1986 with the Bowers versus Hardwick case, but then they laughed at us, right? Justice White said in his majority opinion to say that gay people are protected under the Due Process Clause of the Constitution is risible, right? He found our claims to equality and justice to be laughable, right? Later on, there was fighting, right? And then in the Bergerfeld case, we prevailed, right? And I want to see that more broadly as a picture about diversity and inclusion, right? Initially, 3 decades ago, nobody even knew what diversity and inclusion was, right? And when I started work in diversity and inclusion about 15 years ago, people said, why are you doing this? They kind of laughed at me. They said, you're in the most prestigious field within law, constitutional law. Why would you go over and do this fringe enterprise that nobody has ever heard of, that seems kind of spongy and soft? Notice that nobody is saying that anymore. Now we're in fight mode, right? So because we're in fight mode, all of the things that I just described can be understood as backlash, and that backlash can be understood as a compliment, because it is a testament not to our failure, but to our success, right? And I want to say that my hope is that the next phase after this is we win, right? And that is why these battles are being so hard fought. And when I say we win, I actually don't mean we in the sense of a political party. I don't mean we in terms of demographic cohorts. I don't mean the LGBTQ plus community. I don't mean racial minorities. I mean people who believe in an inclusive community, who believe, again, that there are many different valid ways to be a human being, that all of us deserve to flourish on our independent and authentic terms. And I believe that that is a value worth fighting for and a value that is worth being proud of. Shabbat Shalom.